My wicked mother-in-law made my life impossible every day. You're a disgrace, a good-for-nothing. I always knew you weren't good enough for my son, she shouted in front of my entire family. Until one day, I'd had enough of all her humiliations and decided to take revenge in the worst possible way. Marta gripped the dish towel tightly in her hands as she stared at the pot on the stove. Her mind drifted, caught in memories and frustrations that had been accumulating in silence for years. The stove flames crackled under the lid, and in her head, her mother-in-law's words echoed, "You're not good enough for him. You're not the woman my son deserves." For some reason, that night she felt uneasy, as if something was pushing her to do something outside her routine. She left the pot and looked at the clock on the wall. Her husband, Juan, hadn't come home yet. It was late, and anxiety was beginning to burn in her chest. In recent months, he had changed, becoming more distant and cold, avoiding conversations, touch, even glances. Marta clung to the idea that these were just the ups and downs of marriage. However, it was becoming harder to ignore the intuition telling her that something was wrong. Just at that moment, a noise coming from the main bedroom caught her attention. It was laughter, soft but distinct, a voice that wasn't Juan's. Marta felt a chill run down her spine. Laughter? At this hour? In her own house? The world seemed to stop as she moved slowly down the hall, light and silent steps, her senses sharpened by adrenaline. As she approached the slightly open door, she clearly heard the voices of Juan and another woman. That unknown voice, young and full of flirtation, ignited a fury in her that she had never experienced. She burst the door open, and there they were, Juan, his back turned, and a young woman wrapped in his arms, laughing, playing with the collar of his shirt. Juan looked at her with surprise and disgust, as if she were an unexpected nuisance. He released the woman and stood up, facing Marta without a hint of remorse in his eyes. "What is this?" Marta asked, her voice breaking, her hands trembling. The image before her broke her heart and, at the same time, filled her with visceral rage. Juan let out a sigh, as if he was tired of the scene that, in his mind, was inevitable. "Did you really not know?" he said with a sneer. "Marta, this ended a long time ago. I never loved you, and I think it's time you accepted it. I want a divorce." Marta felt a knot in her throat. Juan's words were like knives, tearing at every little hope she had left. She looked at the woman beside him, a beautiful, radiant young woman who looked at her with a mixture of mockery and pity. "You never loved me?" Marta asked quietly, barely able to utter the words. Juan let out a bitter laugh. "Never. Did you really think I'd stay with you?" Juan's gaze was cold and contemptuous. "From the start, I knew you weren't the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. He paused, searching for the exact words to wound her ugly Marta. "You're boring and sad. My mother was always right about you." That last phrase was the final blow. Marta felt something break inside her. The humiliation, the years of accumulated contempt, the image of that young woman smiling next to Juan, all exploded within her. Her gaze slid across the room and rested on a porcelain figurine on the dresser, a wedding gift she had once considered a symbol of their love. With firm steps, she approached and took the figurine in her hands. Juan kept talking, not noticing the change in her gaze, not perceiving the intensity of her breathing. Each word that left his mouth was like poison seeping into the air. "You know? I pity you, Marta. Sometimes I think of how pathetic you look trying to keep up this farce of a marriage. But I can't keep going like this. You deserve to know the truth." Without further hesitation, Marta raised the porcelain figurine and, without wavering, brought it down on Juan's head. The sound was dull, brutal. He staggered, clutching his head as he fell to the floor. His lover let out a scream, backing away in horror. The porcelain figurine shattered on the floor, breaking into 1,000 pieces, just like the marriage she once thought she had. The room fell into a sepulchral silence. Marta breathed heavily, feeling a mix of liberation and horror. She looked at Juan's inert body, still not fully processing what she had just done. The young woman began to move slowly toward the door, her face pale and frightened. But when she reached the front door, she realized it was locked. Without realizing it, her phone began to ring, breaking the silence and making her jump. Marta approached the door slowly, blocking the young woman's way. Her gaze was intense, fixed, charged with a disturbing calm. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice so soft that it was chilling. The young woman swallowed, unable to say a word. She knew that anything she said could seal her fate. In Marta's gaze, there was no remorse, only an implacable determination, as if she had finally taken control of her life and was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect herself. Marta moved closer, narrowing the distance between them, never taking her eyes off the young woman who, paralyzed by fear, kept her gaze fixed on her, silently pleading to be let go. But Marta had other plans. After all, she had endured too many humiliations and contempt in silence. It was time to face reality and finally take control. She breathed deeply, trying to calm her frantic heartbeat. She stared fixedly at the young woman who stood just a few steps from the door, motionless, her face white as paper. The phone kept ringing in the girl's hand, filling the space with a tension that felt almost palpable. Marta stopped blocking the door and walked toward the living room, as if something within her had radically changed. "You don't have to be afraid. I don't want to hurt you," she said in a calm voice, but her words couldn't completely hide the mix of pain and anger burning in her eyes. The young woman, still paralyzed, tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was a whirl of confusion, fear, and shame. Her name was Clara, but at that moment, she felt like a ghost, an invisible being that had crossed the limits of what was allowed. She had come to this house believing that Juan had control, that he had closed a chapter. He had told her that his marriage was dead, that his wife was a broken woman, someone lifeless, trapped in a shell of routine and disappointment. But now, facing Marta, Clara began to doubt every word Juan had said to her. Marta let herself fall into one of the dining room chairs and looked at Clara with a sad expression, as if she were trying to see through her. "You know, I never thought it would come to this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She lowered her gaze to her hands, which still shook slightly. "Juan deceived me for a long time, not just with you, but with many things. He made me believe that I was the problem." Clara took a step toward her, with a mix of empathy and fear in her eyes. The situation was more complex than she had imagined, and now, caught in that tense silence, she felt the urge to say something, anything that might calm Marta. I'm sorry. I didn't know that," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Marta interrupted her with a bitter smile. "You're sorry? What exactly are you sorry for?" she asked, raising her gaze. Her voice was no longer so calm. There was a flash of pain and contained fury. "Are you sorry for me? Because he lied to you? Or for yourself, for being trapped here?" Clara swallowed, unable to respond. Her eyes reflected a mix of shame and regret. She wanted to say something to explain that she didn't know, that she had fallen into Juan's trap like so many others. But the words stuck in her throat. Juan was always good with words, Marta continued, looking away to the window, lost in her own thoughts. He knew how to manipulate, how to make you feel small, as if everything was your fault. Did he tell you that too? That I was the reason for all his problems, that he was trapped with me and had no way out? Clara's expression confirmed the question, and Marta let out a bitter laugh. Of course. That's what he always does. He destroys someone with his words and then presents himself as the victim. A heavy silence settled in the room, in which both women were immersed in their own thoughts, trapped in a web of lies and betrayals woven by the same man. Marta, with the broken porcelain figure still by her side, began to recall each moment when she had felt she was losing her dignity by clinging to a marriage that, for her, was sacred, but which Juan treated as mere convenience. Finally, Marta broke the silence. Did he ever tell you anything about our story? Do you know how long we were together? She asked, observing her with a mix of curiosity and pain. Clara shook her head, nervously biting her lip. He told me you'd been together for years, but that things weren't the same anymore. That you had changed, gained weight. Marta laughed again, but this time there was a deep sadness in her eyes. Of course, I changed. Of course, I changed, she murmured to herself, feeling how helplessness twisted her soul. After everything we went through together, he had to blame someone. And if he didn't feel good about himself, the easiest was to blame me. Marta closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain a wave of emotions. He never tolerated the idea of aging, of seeing how time transformed us. And when the wrinkles began to appear, when my body stopped being what it once was, he convinced himself that the problem was me. Clara watched her, feeling each word sink deep into her chest. She felt exposed, as if, without realizing it, she had become complicit in Juan's disdain and cruelty toward this woman who now seemed so vulnerable and at the same time so resolute. I didn't mean to hurt you, Clara said, though she knew her words were insufficient. I just thought he was sincere, that he was truly trapped in a marriage he didn't want. What he didn't want was to take any responsibility, Marta replied, now in a serene, almost resigned voice. Juan has always been like that. And I allowed it, accepted it. I thought that with time he would change, that he would see something in me worth his respect, his love. But that never happened. I was always, Marta's voice broke a little. I was always the one who mattered least in his life. Clara looked at the door again, searching for an exit, an escape from this situation loaded with emotions and guilt. But Marta noticed her movement and stood up, her eyes fixed on her. I haven't finished talking to you, Clara, she said, her voice firm, with no trace of the vulnerability she had shown before. Clara nodded, feeling she had no choice. She wanted to run, but she knew she had to face the consequences of her decisions. She forced herself to hold Marta's gaze, waiting for what would come next. Marta took a step toward her and spoke in a deep, almost whispering voice, as if revealing a secret she had kept for a long time. You will be the last, Clara. The last person he deceives, uses, and discards as if it were nothing. I won't let him keep doing this. I have lost much, but I won't lose what little dignity I have left. Clara didn't respond, but her eyes showed a mix of respect and fear. There was something in Marta, something she had never seen in a woman she had believed to be broken until that moment. Now, standing before her was someone much stronger and more determined than she could have imagined. The phone rang again, cutting through the silence. Clara looked at it and Marta nodded. Answer it. But don't tell anyone what you saw here. Because if you do, Marta left the sentence unfinished, but her gaze was clear. Clara knew what that warning meant. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the phone and answered, murmuring a quick excuse to the person on the other end of the line. She hung up and both remained silent once more. I want you to leave, Marta finally said. But before you go, I want you to know something. Never be someone a man only sees what he wants in. Never be a shadow, an idea of what someone else needs. Because they always end up destroying what they believe they can control. Clara nodded slowly, letting those words sink into her mind. She felt a wave of understanding, a kind of release she hadn't expected. She had come to that house seeking something for herself, but now, as she left, she felt filled with a new sadness and clarity. Without saying anything else, she opened the door and left. The night was cold and dark, but Clara felt as if she had just escaped from a much deeper darkness. Marta watched her leave, feeling an unsettling peace within. That night, something within her had changed forever. The night was moving slowly. Marta sat alone in the same chair where she had poured out years of pain and humiliation in front of Clara. Outside, the wind blew through the bare branches, and the sound gave the house an air of unease, as if its very walls were absorbing the weight of what had happened hours before. Marta felt an inexplicable emptiness in her chest, a mixture of liberation and loss, a space left by something that, although it had tormented her, had also been a part of her life for so long. Juan's body was still in the basement. She hadn't had the energy to move it, not even to cover it. She just felt exhausted, emotionally and physically, as if all the energy she once had was ripped out along with her husband's lies. But deep in her mind, She knew this moment of peace wouldn't last forever. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Clara hadn't been able to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Marta, standing before her with that mix of strength and despair in her eyes, returned to her mind. Guilt twisted her stomach. She knew she had been naive, that she had allowed herself to be manipulated by the words of a man who never valued anyone but himself. Her own decisions had led her to that moment, and in her mind, Marta had become a figure she couldn't forget. Without thinking too much, Clara got up and dressed, determined to return. There was something she needed to say to Marta, a kind of apology, but also something more. Part of her felt that, in some strange sense, they both shared the same pain. She arrived at the house before dawn. The place was in darkness, and Clara noticed the door was slightly open, as if Marta had left it that way on purpose. She entered slowly, feeling a mixture of fear and resignation. Marta was awake, sitting in the living room, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the house. Seeing her, Clara hesitated, but finally cleared her throat. "Marta, I came because I needed to talk to you," Clara said softly, not knowing where to begin. Marta looked at her, surprised to see her there so early, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and gestured for her to sit across from her. "I don't know what to say, really." "I never thought you'd come back," Marta said, looking at her with a mix of curiosity and reservation. Clara took a deep breath, trying to find the words. "I know I was part of all this, and that what I did to you was horrible." Her voice trembled. "But I also know that he used me. He made me believe things that weren't true, made me see only what he wanted me to see. And, in a way, I let myself be blinded." Marta observed her in silence. There was something in the way Clara spoke, something that resonated within her. It wasn't the first time she had seen someone caught in the web of one's lies. But for the first time, she felt that this young woman understood her own role in the harm they had caused together. "That's what he always did," Marta said with a bitter smile. "He made you feel important, but only when it suited him. He made you believe you were in control, but in reality, he was pulling all the strings from the shadows." Clara nodded, lowering her gaze. "The worst part is that he made me doubt myself. He made me believe I was wrong for wanting more, for hoping for something sincere. But now I understand that he never loved anyone but himself." Marta let out a sigh and nodded. "It's hard to understand, isn't it?" she said, looking at her with a mix of empathy and sadness. "For years, I thought the problem was me. His mother would always say to me, 'You're lucky my son is with you.' She made me believe that I was the fortunate one, that I had to endure everything because he chose me. But now I see that I was just another victim of his narcissism." Silence stretched between them, a pause filled with understanding and sadness. Clara leaned back in her chair, looking at Marta with a mix of respect and guilt. "Marta, if there's anything I can do to help," she said, almost in a whisper, unsure of what she could offer at that moment. Marta looked at her carefully, evaluating the sincerity in her words. She knew Clara had been manipulated, just as she had, but she also knew that the presence of this young woman was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. "There's nothing you can do to change what's already happened," Marta replied firmly, "but there is something you can do for yourself." Clara looked at her with curiosity, waiting for Marta to continue. "Never again allow anyone to make you feel small," Marta said. "Never become someone who waits to be saved by another. Make sure you build something that belongs only to you. Because when someone like him comes along, all they know how to do is destroy." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with tears she didn't know how to hold back. Marta had become something more than just a woman she had hurt. She was a kind of mirror, a warning, and, at the same time, a symbol of strength she hadn't expected. They stayed in silence until Marta spoke again, this time with an almost unsettling calm. "He's in the basement," she said, without looking at her. "Last night, after you left, I couldn't think of anything other than how this entire situation had changed me, made me into someone I didn't recognize. But now I realize that it was never a transformation. I was just bringing out what he had buried in me for so long." Clara watched her with a mixture of fear and admiration. "What do you plan to do, Marta?" she asked softly, dreading the answer. Marta remained silent for a few seconds, as if she were thinking about each word before saying it. "I'm going to free myself from him," she finally answered. "But not in the way you imagine. I don't want his memory to haunt me. I don't want to carry the weight of what I did or what he did. I want to be free of everything of him, of his mother, of the words that made me feel like less. And for that, I need the past to stay where it belongs." Clara didn't fully understand her words, but something in her tone conveyed a feeling of peace and resolution. Marta was no longer the wounded, broken woman she had seen the previous night. She was someone who had made peace with her own pain, who had accepted the darkness and turned it into her strength. The young woman slowly stood up, feeling like there was nothing left to say. "Thank you, Marta," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Marta nodded, looking at her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Clara. And remember what I told you." Clara left the house, feeling like each step was leading her toward a new version of herself. She knew her life would never be the same after that night, but for the first time in a long time, she felt capable of facing her own reflection without regret. Marta watched the door close, and for the first time in years, she felt genuine peace. She had faced her fears, her demons, and had let go of the burden of a love that had never been real. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, Marta stood up and walked toward the basement. She felt neither fear nor hatred, just a deep serenity. Marta descended the stairs to the basement, each step echoing deeply in the silence of the early morning. The dimness of that underground space, with its brick walls and stale, damp air, reminded her of the darkest corner of her life, the place in her mind where she had hidden feelings of abandonment and scorn for years. But that morning, as the dawn light crept through the crack of a tiny window, everything seemed different. There was something within her that felt, for the first time, free and light, as if the burden she had borne was dissolving, turning to dust as she descended. There, on the floor, lay Juan, semi-conscious, the mark of his betrayal etched in the wound Marta had left on him. The porcelain figure she had used to strike him was shattered into pieces, scattered around him like a symbolic farewell to everything that marriage had once meant. She stopped a few steps away from him, observing him with a mixture of compassion and firmness. Juan began to stir, his eyes partially open, trying to focus. Recognizing Marta standing before him, a flicker of fear appeared in his gaze. "Why?" he mumbled, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "Marta, what are you doing?" She observed him silently for a moment, not responding. She stood there, in front of the man who had been the center of her life for so many years, but who had also been the source of her fears, insecurities, and pain. The one who, in his attempt to control her, had left an indelible mark on her heart. "That's what I should be asking you, Juan," she finally replied, her voice soft yet firm. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you treat me as if I were an obstacle, as if I were never enough for you?" Juan tried to sit up, but the pain forced him to remain on the floor, looking up at her. In his eyes was a mixture of disbelief and resentment. "Marta, this isn't necessary. We can talk, like adults," he said, attempting to regain his usual control, that tone of voice he had always used to manipulate, to make his words sound like the only possible truth. But Marta was no longer the woman he thought he knew. She watched as he tried to maintain his facade, struggled to keep the control he had always had over her. But now, she was in a different position, and she was no longer vulnerable to his words. "Talk like adults?" she repeated with a bitter smile. "I spent years trying to talk to you, trying to make you see me, to listen to me. And every time you ignored me, dismissed me, made me feel as if I were worth nothing." Marta paused, her eyes fixed on his. "There's nothing you can say now that will give me back all the time you stole from me, all the pieces of myself I left for you." Juan breathed heavily, his gaze bewildered, as if he still didn't understand that control was no longer in his hands. He was a man used to things going his way, to people orbiting around him as if they were part of a universe created solely for his comfort and satisfaction. You always made me responsible for your own emptiness, for your insecurities," Marta continued, her voice filled with a calm that made her seem even more unbreakable. "You made me feel like I was never enough, that I had to change to please you, to be what you wanted. And all that for nothing. Because in the end, it wasn't me who was broken." Juan clenched his teeth, finally acknowledging the gravity of the situation. For years, he had managed to make Marta doubt herself, to think her love for him was a kind of obligation and not a choice. But at that moment, facing a woman who looked at him with unwavering conviction, Juan felt, for the first time, the weight of his own lie. "Marta," he began, trying to soften his tone, "I didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe we both made mistakes." She let out a short, joyless laugh. That response was exactly what she expected from him, the same empty excuse, the same evasion of responsibility she had heard so many times. "Mistakes," she murmured, letting the word dissolve into the air. "No, Juan, it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to hurt me. You chose to betray the trust one placed in you. I gave you everything I had, but you just took and took, until there was nothing left of me." Juan was silent, the hardness in Marta's eyes making him feel small, almost insignificant. In that moment, he understood he had lost something he would never be able to regain, and the emptiness of that realization hit him harder than any words could express. "Marta, I can't change what I did," he said with a trembling voice, recognizing his defeat. She looked at him, and for the first time in many years, she saw him as he truly was, a fragile man, a hollow shell of confidence and control. She felt no hatred, no resentment. Instead, there was only a deep sadness, a silent lament for the lost time, the shattered dreams, and the love she had once believed to be real. "I don't want you to change anything," she replied firmly. "I only want you to take responsibility for who you are, for what you did to us both. Because I am no longer the same person." Marta took a deep breath, as if releasing a weight she had carried for years. "And for the first time, I feel like I can be free of all this." Juan remained silent, not knowing what to say. For the first time, he had nothing to offer her. There were no words that could repair the damage, no lies that could manipulate that truth. Marta left him there, alone with his thoughts, his regret, and his own guilt. She turned and slowly climbed the stairs, feeling she was leaving behind a part of her life that no longer belonged to her. When she reached the top, she stopped for a moment, looking around the house. Every corner was full of memories, but they no longer hurt. Now they only reminded her of the strength she had discovered within herself, the ability to rebuild. She stepped into the garden, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to illuminate the day. She breathed in the fresh air and closed her eyes, allowing the breeze to caress her face. She felt at peace, as if she had emerged from a prison she had unconsciously built around herself. A light smile appeared on her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. In her mind, there was no hatred toward Juan, no resentment toward the past. Only the resolution to build a different future, one that belonged solely to her, a future in which she could live without fear, without resentment, and without the burden of someone who had never valued her. Marta closed the door of the house behind her and paused for a moment on the porch, feeling a release she had never experienced before. Despite everything that had happened, something inside her had finally calmed. Every dark corner of her life now seemed illuminated by the decision she had just made. She was determined to leave that place behind, to let go of the burden she had carried for so many years, to start anew. But as she took a few steps toward the path, she noticed a figure approaching from across the street. It was her mother-in-law. The woman, dressed in dark clothes and with the stern expression Marta knew all too well, was striding quickly toward her. In her eyes, there was anger and contempt, as if from a distance, she already knew that something terrible had happened. "Marta," she shouted, clutching her purse tightly as she closed the last few feet. "What have you done to my son? What have you done?" Her voice was full of indignation and horror, and her eyes desperately searched for any sign of Juan. Marta, feeling the calm she had found shatter into 1,000 pieces, tried to maintain her composure. "I did nothing to him that he didn't deserve," she replied softly, trying to avoid an unnecessary confrontation. But those words only served to further ignite her mother-in-law's fury. "You're a disgrace. A good-for-nothing. I always knew you weren't good enough for him. I knew you weren't worthy of my son," she continued, her voice laced with venom. "But this is a crime. I'm going to call the police. I'll make sure you're locked up forever. You almost killed him. You're insane." Juan's mother took out her phone and began to dial with trembling fingers, all the while casting looks of disgust at Marta. The situation felt like a nightmare. Her screams began to attract the attention of some neighbors, who peeked out from windows and doors, whispering among themselves. Soon after, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer by the second. Marta didn't attempt to run. There was no fear on her face, only resignation and a calm that shielded her from the fury her mother-in-law hurled at her with each word. When the police arrived, Juan's mother approached them and, with a mix of tears and drama, explained the situation. "This woman, she almost killed my son," she cried, pointing at Marta. "She's a threat. She needs to be locked up. She's a potential murderer." The officers approached Marta and, in a firm voice, asked her to turn around so they could handcuff her. She complied without resistance. As they cuffed her wrists, she could hear her mother-in-law's words, each one dripping with hatred and contempt. But Marta remained silent. In her mind, she kept telling herself she had done what was right, that in the end, she had faced her reality and found the peace she had longed for. Inside the patrol car, as the red and blue lights flashed across the neighboring houses, Marta closed her eyes, feeling that, in some way, this ride in the patrol car was also a release. Hours later, she found herself in a small cell at the station, the gray walls and the damp smell permeating the air. Everything was cold and dark, but Marta felt serene. It was a peace she had paid dearly for but had finally obtained. She knew this wasn't the end, that she would still have to face justice, but for the first time in years, fear didn't paralyze her. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Juan appeared in front of her cell, and behind him, his mother. Her mother-in-law's face was full of resentment, but Juan's looked strange, almost ashamed. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at each other through the bars. Finally, Juan broke the silence. "I'm not pressing charges, Marta," he said, his voice low but steady. His mother looked at him in disbelief, grabbing his arm as if trying to make him change his mind. "What do you mean you're not pressing charges? This woman is a criminal. She attacked you. You can't just let her go after what she did." Juan looked at his mother, his face pale but with a resolute expression. "Mom, enough. You can't keep controlling every aspect of my life, especially after what happened," he replied, with a tone Marta had never heard before. "This was my fault. I was the one who hurt Marta, who drove her to this point. She's not the only one responsible here." His mother stared at him with wide eyes, in complete disbelief. To her, her son had always been perfect, incapable of doing wrong. But now, in the harshness of the situation, that image was crumbling. "Juan, you're talking like a madman. This is absurd. This woman almost killed you. You can't just..." Her voice trembled, but Juan interrupted her. "What you don't know, Mom, is that I was the one who left her broken. I was the one who hurt her. Maybe in a way you can't see or understand, but I was the one who betrayed and wounded her long before she reacted. I don't want to cause any more harm than I already have." His mother fell silent, looking at him as if she didn't recognize the man standing before her. Marta, from the other side of the bars, listened to every word, her heart heavy. She had never thought Juan would be capable of admitting his responsibility, of acknowledging that he had sown the seeds of pain that had led them to this moment. But his mother murmured, unable to find words to respond. Her words got caught in her throat, unable to express what she felt. Juan turned to Marta, his face showing a hint of humanity for the first time. "I'm sorry, Marta," he said. a sincere sadness in his voice. "I can't undo what I did or the pain I caused you, but I don't want to hurt you anymore. This has been enough." Marta looked into his eyes, trying to understand if his words were genuine. She had expected hatred or resentment, but instead, she found regret. Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but at least those words offered her a sense of closure, a more human farewell than she had imagined. An officer approached and motioned to Marta, indicating they were taking her to the interrogation room to sign some documents. As she passed by Juan, Marta stopped for a second and looked at him with a calmness he had never seen in her. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to heal," she said softly, as if that phrase were a final truth shared between them. Juan nodded slightly, understanding the weight of those words. Marta was led out of the cell, and as she walked down the hallway toward the exit, she felt that, somehow, this moment was giving her a chance to move forward, a chance to be reborn. She had faced her fears, confronted her own history, and now, at last, she felt free. Juan's mother remained silent, watching as her son gazed after Marta as she left. For the first time, she understood that her son's love had been an illusion, a relationship she had fostered and controlled. Now, she would have to accept that nothing would ever be the same again, that this broken marriage had become a release, both for Marta and for Juan. Marta stepped out of the police station, and as the cool morning breeze touched her face, she took a deep breath, feeling as though life was offering her a second chance. Marta walked out of the police station with slow steps, as if she were learning to walk in a world she was only beginning to rediscover. The morning breeze was fresh and gentle, and the sky, still a pale gray, promised the beginning of a new day. Each breath of cold air made her feel alive, as if she were truly awake for the first time. She looked toward the street, toward the horizon, and felt that life was giving her an opportunity she never imagined possible, to start anew, unbound, free from the weight of years of pain she had endured. Not knowing exactly where to go, Marta began to walk. In her thoughts, fragments of memories mingled, scenes from what her life had once been with Juan, her relationship with her mother-in-law, her own unconditional devotion to a marriage that had never treated her with dignity. She felt that with each step, she was distancing herself a little more from the invisible prison she had lived in. After a while, she stopped in front of a park, a simple, small place, but with enough calm to invite her to sit. Marta chose a bench and sat down, watching the few passers-by who were starting their day. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, simply existed, with no purpose other than to feel her own presence in the world. "Are you Marta?" A gentle, cautious voice broke the silence. Marta opened her eyes and saw a young woman standing in front of her, holding a folder in her hands and looking at her with a mix of interest and respect. The young woman had a kind expression, and her eyes conveyed a sincere curiosity. "Yes, I am. Do we know each other?" Marta asked, puzzled. The young woman smiled and shook her head. "My name is Elena. I'm a journalist." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "I followed your case. I couldn't help but notice how things changed since the day of your arrest and how you became a figure that has generated a lot of interest." Marta felt a mixture of surprise and discomfort. She had never considered that her story might interest anyone beyond those involved. The idea of talking about her life with someone she didn't know felt strange, almost intrusive. However, there was something in Elena's gaze, in her calm presence, that gave her a sense of trust. "I'm not sure there's anything interesting about what happened," Marta said with a sigh. "I'm just a woman who made mistakes, a woman who endured more than she should have. Nothing more." Elena sat beside her with a calmness that respected Marta's space and privacy. "I think there's more to it than that, Marta. I've read about your story, about how you held on to a marriage that drained you, how you defended something that, to many, was already lost. And yet, you came out of it all. There's something in your experience that many people could understand, something that speaks of liberation, of strength. Not many women can say they found a way out of that kind of pain. Marta looked at her, feeling how her words resonated deeply. She had never thought of her story as an example of strength. To her, it had been a story of suffering, of losses and disappointments. Yet now, seeing her life through another's eyes, she understood that perhaps there was something of value in her struggle. "I don't feel strong, you know?" Marta murmured, her voice trembling. All of this, it was like a dream, a nightmare that lasted for years. "I don't know if breaking free is something to be proud of. I just know that it was the only thing I could do to survive." Elena nodded, looking at her with empathy. "Sometimes, the greatest strength is in accepting that we can't continue as we are," she said gently. "There are many people trapped in relationships that hurt them, but who never dare to confront them. You did something that few people have the courage to do. You faced your own fears, your own pain. It's not just a story of loss, but of rebirth." Marta remained silent, letting those words sink into her mind. Rebirth. She had never thought of it that way. For her, everything had been a matter of survival, of finding a way out of her pain. But now, she was beginning to see her experience from another perspective, as an opportunity to rebuild herself, to rise from the ashes of a life that had consumed her. After a while, she looked at Elena with a faint smile. "Maybe you're right," she said softly, as if speaking to herself. "Maybe all of this gave me a second chance, a way to start anew, to discover who I really am." Elena nodded, pleased to see that glimmer of understanding in Marta's eyes. "If you ever want to tell your story, no pressure, of course. I'm here to listen. I believe that many people would find hope in your words, Marta. Because it's not just the story of a betrayal, but of a woman who managed to face herself and, amid all the pain, found a way forward." Marta nodded slowly. The idea of telling her story, of sharing it with others, seemed strange and challenging, but also intriguing. Maybe, through her words, she could help someone else, give meaning to all she had suffered. "Thank you, Elena," she said, sincerity in her voice. "I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about all of this, but if I ever am, you'll be the first to know." They shared a silent smile, and then Elena said goodbye and walked away, leaving Marta alone in the park. Marta stayed on the bench, watching as the sun rose in the sky and filled every corner of the park with light. She felt light, as if something inside her had found a purpose she hadn't imagined before. With renewed determination, Marta stood up and began to walk, leaving the park behind. Her life, though still uncertain, now had new meaning. She knew there was much to discover, to understand about herself, and that each step forward was an opportunity to build a life that belonged to her, a life free of fears, of chains, and of imposed silences. As she walked through the city streets, observing the people around her, Marta felt an unexpected joy, a hope that illuminated her soul. She had suffered, she had fallen, and she had lost much, but now, for the first time, she felt that her life belonged only to her. A few weeks later, Marta had found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a simple yet luminous space. The windows faced a lush park, and in the mornings, sunlight filtered through the leaves, illuminating the white, empty walls. It was her first true home, a place without painful memories or shadows from the past. In that quiet solitude, Marta began to build a new life. Every corner, every item she placed, served as a reminder of the freedom she had achieved. One day, as she was organizing a few belongings on a shelf, she found an old photo of herself from when she was young and newly married. The Marta in the photo had a hopeful, almost innocent expression. She looked at it silently, reflecting on the journey she had taken, the scars and lessons that had marked her soul. The sound of her phone pulled her out of her thoughts. It was Clara, who had become a close friend since that day at her home. Clara had reached out to Marta sometime after their conversation in the park, and although Marta initially hesitated, she eventually agreed to stay in touch. Somehow, they had become mutual sources of support, a reminder of the life lessons they had both learned. "Marta, I did it." Clara's voice was filled with excitement, and her breathless tone came through even over the phone. Marta smiled, already guessing the reason for her call. "You did it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, I quit my job and finally opened the bookstore," Clara said with a mix of joy and relief. "I never thought I'd have the courage to leave something secure to follow my dream, but I did. And it's all thanks to you." Marta felt a lump in her throat, a warm and profound emotion filling her with pride. "It wasn't thanks to me, Clara. You decided to make the change yourself, you took the reins. I was just there to support you, just as you were there for me," Marta replied, a smile evident in her voice. "Even so, I'd never have gotten here without your support. You didn't just change your life, Marta, you changed mine too. And I think you should know that." Clara's words echoed in the quiet apartment. Marta felt grateful, but above all, fulfilled. She had discovered that through her own story of pain and rebirth, she could help others find their way. After she hung up, Marta felt an indescribable peace. She knew there would be other challenges in her life, that the journey towards self-discovery and inner peace was a constant process, filled with ups and downs. But now, she understood that every step, even the most painful ones, had a purpose. Every scar was a reminder of her strength, of her ability to rebuild and move forward. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. When she opened it, she found Elena, the young journalist she had met in the park. With a warm, friendly smile, Elena handed her a small envelope. "I thought you'd like this," Elena said. "It's a copy of the first interview you gave me." Marta took the envelope, and they both sat down in the small living room. Elena looked at her with interest, waiting for her reaction as Marta took the paper out of the envelope. It was an article titled, "Rising from the Ashes, Marta's Story and the Courage to Rediscover Herself." In the photo accompanying the text, Marta was seated in that same park with a serene expression, looking toward the horizon. The article told her story, her courage in leaving a toxic relationship and finding a life that truly belonged to her. "It's beautiful, Elena," Marta said, touched, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I deserve all this." "Marta, you're the inspiration that so many people need," Elena replied sincerely. "You didn't just heal your wounds, you showed that it's possible to find peace after such deep suffering. There are so many people, especially women, who will see you and understand that they too can build a life of their own, without fear." Marta nodded, letting those words fill her with genuine pride, a feeling she had never known until then. She knew that her story, with all its scars and shadows, had found a purpose far greater than her own pain. The days turned into weeks, and Elena's article began to gain attention. Marta started receiving messages from people sharing their own stories of resilience and overcoming hardship. Their words became a comfort for Marta, who felt each day that her life was taking on a deeper, more meaningful purpose. One day, she decided to do something she had never thought possible. She returned to the house where it had all begun. She knew she no longer belonged to that place, but she needed to say goodbye to the ghosts that still lingered in her memories. When she entered, she found the empty living room, with echoes of memories resonating in the silence. She looked at every corner, every space, and realized that she no longer felt sadness or resentment, only peace. She approached the window and looked out at the garden where she had so often felt trapped. But now, she saw it with new eyes, with the certainty that her life was no longer chained to that place. She was free. Marta closed her eyes and smiled, letting an air of tranquility fill every part of her being. Before leaving, she left a note on the table in the living room. It simply said, "I have been reborn. Today, this house bids me farewell in peace." It was her goodbye, a final letter to the woman she once was and who, in some way, had given her the strength to become who she was now. As she stepped out of the house, Marta felt lighter than ever. That closure allowed her to move forward with the certainty that her story of struggle and redemption would continue to be her strength, and perhaps the strength of others as well. And so, Marta walked away from that place without looking back, with a smile on her lips and her heart full of gratitude. She knew her life would still bring challenges and lessons, but now she was ready to face them with the confidence of a woman who had learned to love herself, to respect herself, and to keep moving forward, always forward. If this story touched you, please share your feelings in the comments below. If you've gone through a similar experience, I'd love to hear your valuable opinion. I'd be truly honored if you left a like, shared the video with a friend or family member, and subscribed to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story appearing on your screen right now. We guarantee inspiring and exclusive content just for you. See you in the next video.